I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from the Ukrainian counter-offensive, analyse the challenges facing Ukrainian drone pilots, and we look at the issues facing Unilever in Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 28th of July, 1 year and 154 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, foreign reporter Maiden Ananu, special correspondent for business Matt Oliver, and our guest is Spectator journalist speaking live from Ukraine, Svitlana Morinets. I started by asking Joe for the latest news from Ukraine.
So, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted a video in which a group of Ukrainian soldiers said they had taken control of the village Storomovsky. It's in the Donetsk region, but it's right on the border of the Zaporizhzhia region. President Zelensky put on Telegram, "Our South, our guys, glory to Ukraine." So Russian military bloggers and various actors in that location have also been confirming its capture, and there was some quite impressive video which saw a group of Ukrainian Special Forces operatives basically storming into the settlement, there's not a lot left of it. It's very artillery and battle scarred. It's quite sad to see. But while they were going in, they managed to capture a number of Russian paratroopers and force them to surrender. And the Ukrainian Special Forces group basically claimed that they had captured some information that will be useful in the battle ahead. But looking at that now, the capture of Storomovsky back from Russia has now opened up a new push south out of Velka, Novosilka, towards Berdyansk, the coastal town on the Sea of Azov. And Russian telegram channels, your usual suspects, from the most authoritative to the random commentators, were all a bit panicked by this capture yesterday, essentially because it now puts Ukraine in a position to perform a sort of pincer movement around the neighbouring village of Urazani. And essentially, Ukraine, from its position in Storomovsky, it can push and try and capture the western and northern tips of this latest settlement next door. So that's good news for Ukraine. Urazani is only about 5 miles south from Velka Novosilka, which is where Ukraine started its sort of southern push through the Donetsk region. We guess the aim is to push all the way down to the Azov and capture Berdyansk. Capturing that port town from Russian occupation would effectively drive a wedge between Moscow's forces in the south and the east. It would help sever Russia's land bridge with occupied Crimea. So it looks like an important capture. It's slow and hard-fought gains, but again, it's more proof that Ukraine is advancing and carrying on pushing forward, even if it is little pieces of land at a time. There are more details on the counter-offensive, but they were more based on yesterday, so I'll start with an update in Moscow first. So Russia's defense ministry claims it thwarted a Ukrainian drone attack in the Moscow region overnight. So the ministry said the UAV was destroyed by means of air defense, and it added there were no casualties or damage. The Moscow mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, had earlier announced the attack without specifying its location. He said an enemy drone attack attempt was made. So the attempted attack, like always, Ukraine is very coy and doesn't give up technical information or even clarifications on these kind of things, basically to keep Russia in the lurch, because Russia knows it can reach Moscow, it knows it can reach Crimea, but the Ukrainians like to keep this operational secrecy and sort of a mystique around its long-range ability secret. But the attempted strike comes days after Ukraine claimed a drone attack in central Moscow. Now let's look to what we were speaking about yesterday, and on that Tokmak Kyiv axis, the southern pushing axis through Zaporizhzhia, which is now believed to be the main thrust of Ukraine's counteroffensive, where the most resources are being thrown at it, even though Bakhmut is probably more successful at the moment. So yesterday, Ukraine launched a massive HIMARS strike on a Russian-held city in the south of the country as a major counter-offensive thrust started showing signs of success. The long-range missile strike reportedly hit an ammunition dump in the Zaporizhzhia town of Tokmak, and that town is important because it's a vital logistics hub connecting occupied Crimea to the Donbass via a rail link. While the ammunition element wasn't confirmed, we get the suggestion it was ammunition by various reports of secondary explosions on the ground. Those are often associated with ammunition essentially cooking off. So a bullet gets hot, it will eventually explode. A rocket, an ammunition shell, artillery shell, it will cook off and explode even though it wasn't damaged in the initial strike. But earlier yesterday, Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade broke through Russian defences to reach the outskirts of Robotny, which is a village about 12 miles to the northeast of Tokmak. So Ukraine is also sort of travelling south from its hub in Kyiv towards Tokmak and having some successes. This was believed to be the first moment that Ukraine had managed to break through a major line of defence in a mechanised sort of combined arms assault. There was reports of US Bradley vehicles, German-made Leopard tanks. We saw some other Soviet tanks involved as well, looked like a T-72. So the Moscow-installed head of the Zaporizhzhia region, he suggested it was around 100 armoured vehicles involved, but other Russian sources have downgraded that and put the number between 30 and 50. I was lucky enough to get into contact with a member of the 47th Brigade yesterday, and just to give you some context, the 47th Brigade, throughout this conflict, it started as a volunteer group in Kyiv at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and that has now been upgraded to a full brigade as part of the counter-offensive. It's armed with US Bradleys, which gives us the hint of their involvement before I managed to get in contact with them, and as well as an M55 Slovenian tank, which is essentially an old Soviet tank but has been upgraded with new NATO standard cannons, sights and armour. Yeah, so the 47th Brigade told me via Telegram communications that they were using Western weapons to destroy the enemy in a fight over defensive trenches on the northern tip of Robotny. Western officials have suggested the attack on Robotny signalled the beginning of a new phase in Ukraine's counteroffensive with the introduction of thousands of well-trained troops to the battle. British intelligence officials described the push as a major offensive operation, while Washington described it as the main thrust of Kyiv's long-heralded counter-offensive. So Ukrainian forces had likely managed to penetrate and drive through tactically challenging defensive positions to reach where they were fighting in the trenches, according to the US-based think tank, the Institute of the Study of War. And why is this important? The advance essentially came after 2 months of really grinding, slow-paced gains where Ukraine has struggled to breach minefields. As I was spoken of yesterday and in previous weeks, they had to resort to getting out of their Western vehicles, they had to go into these minefields on foot and basically demine as they went along. So it's actually a kind of a great positive push that a armoured thrust has managed to break through these defences. Responding to the assault, Russian forces essentially launched various aerial and long-range bombardments, artillery, on various towns around Kyiv. I think there was about 30 in total. Vladimir Putin himself, while he was meeting African leaders yesterday, he confirmed the counteroffensive had intensified significantly, but he rode back on successes and basically said that Russia had managed to destroy some 26 tanks, and he hailed Russian heroism that had beaten back Ukraine on all fronts. So what we've seen from video footage, a lone tank was filmed rolling towards a ditch ahead of a line of dragon's teeth, so those intertwined concrete blocks that have formed a key part of Russia's defences. They essentially stop a tank or an armoured vehicle rolling up to them, and if a tank or armoured vehicle does try to go over them, it will eventually go over them, but it will expose the weak underbelly of the armoured vehicle. So earlier geolocated footage appeared to show a Soviet-era T-72 tank and 2 Bradley's vehicles, likely operated by the 47th, abandoned near a defensive line in Robotny. We don't know if they were abandoned or disabled or completely destroyed, but it's good news. So what we know from this push is it was enough to spook Russia, but it has fizzled out a bit. This is just me. I again, like, the fog of war stops me from, or any of us, from knowing exactly what's going on. But judging by what the 47th told me yesterday, and I'll read the quote out, "We have not entered the settlement yet." So they're talking about Robotny. "Fighting continues in the trench positions in front." There are some suggestions that those trenches are between 800 metres and a kilometre from the actual centre of the village. So artillery is covering our infantry, and Bradley crews are destroying enemy infantry and their equipment. And aerial reconnaissance aircraft provide a picture so that our commanders can command and control the battle. So essentially, and this is my reading of it, it looks like the 47th have reached a tree line outside of Robotny, and they have basically taken up position and are now continuing basically to whittle down, almost to degrade, and through an attritional approach, Russian defences on the outskirts of the town, in the hope of being able to edge closer forward. They obviously don't want to commit another full frontal attack, because those are costly, they cost equipment, they cost men. So they're going to take a slower approach and use what has essentially become Ukraine's qualitative, so better quality, advantage in long-range strikes, whether it be HIMARS, other precision munitions, and 155 artillery. It seems like Ukraine have the qualitative advantage, even though they might not have the quantitative advantage over Russia. But as I said, yeah, look, it slightly died down a little bit this morning, but it was good news. It was part of a gradual advance as Ukraine looks to push south through Donetsk, through Zaporizhzhia, towards the Sea of Azov, in the hope of splitting Russian forces in the south and the east, and essentially cutting off that land bridge there. So as well as that, there are also advances south of Bakhmut, where Ukraine are now trying to essentially double envelop the enemy there. Hanna Maliar, who is the Deputy Defence Minister of Ukraine and also sort of its biggest spokeswoman at the moment, said fighting was taking place in 3 villages on the outskirts of Bakhmut, and said the fighting is pretty harsh and the enemy fire is intense, but it looks like Ukraine is doing enough to try and put itself in a position which will give it some sort of artillery targeting over the centre of Bakhmut, and potentially basically cut off Russian forces from moving elsewhere. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Joe, for giving us the readout there. Maiden and Nanu, can I go to you? There's been quite a few diplomatic updates that you've been covering on the Telegraph's live blog. Where would you like to start?
Maybe we could start with the Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg. This is the second day, and Putin has told African leaders that Moscow is carefully examining proposals made by some African leaders to end the conflict in Ukraine. And he told them that we respect your initiatives and we are examining them carefully. Yesterday, the African Union chair appealed for peaceful coexistence between Russia and Ukraine in a speech. And obviously Putin made the offer of a grain deal to, I think it was 6 African nations. And Zimbabwe actually said that it was food secure, but it was grateful for his offer.
Thanks, Maidna. Now, as we know, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defence minister, has been visiting North Korea. Maidna, what's happening there?
Sergei Shoigu marked the first visit by a top Russian defence official since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And actually, just before I came in, I saw a video on Twitter. It appeared to show that Kim Jong-un had decked out his residence with really big photos of Putin everywhere. But it shows Chinese and Russian officials with Kim Jong-un essentially to mark the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War. And obviously Washington has made its concerns known about the ties between North Korea and Russia. And Kim apparently hosted a reception and lunch with Shoigu, and he vowed solidarity with Russia's people and military. And in turn, Shoigu praised the North Korean military as the strongest in the world, and the two discussed strategic security and defence cooperation.
Well, let's head to Washington then, Maidna. There's been a couple of updates out of the US. Let's start with the visit of Giorgia Meloni to the White House.
Joe Biden welcomed Giorgia Meloni to the White House, and they appeared to be getting on quite well from the pictures. And apparently Biden's concerns about Meloni's ideology have been eased owing to her support for Ukraine. And obviously Italy is about to take up the G7 presidency next year. And I think Biden said in a readout that Italy and the United States are also standing strong with Ukraine. And I compliment you on your very strong support in defending against Russian atrocities, and that's what they are. And he thanked Italy for their support for Ukraine.
Thanks, Maidna. There's also been an interesting statement by the Russian ambassador to the US, commenting on the state of relations between the US and Russia. Maidna, what did he say?
Yeah, so he has basically said that Russian-American relations are practically non-existent. So Russia has made no secret of its unhappiness with the fact that the US has provided cluster munitions to Ukraine. And he basically said, yeah, they are non-existent. And he called it an anti-Russian move, which is quite similar language to what we've heard before.
Thank you very much, Maidna Nanu, and thank you, Joe Barnes, earlier for your updates there. Let's go to our guest now, Svetlana Moranets, speaking from Kyiv. Svetlana, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. We want to talk a little bit about your work for The Spectator magazine on drone warfare. So could you just give us a broad lay of the land in the drone war? How are they employed? How many are we talking? How have both sides evolved how they use drones? What have you found?
Sure. Both sides, they don't share the numbers of how many drones they use. Ukraine has the quality advantage over Russian drones, but not the quantity. Some estimates have said Ukraine is losing 10,000 drones a month. So this year, the government has allocated over $1 billion to invest in the drone industry to keep up with the losses and the Russian army that has many more drones. Drones are needed because they save the lives of the soldiers, and they are very effective on the battlefield. If we talk about reconnaissance drones, they help to increase the efficiency of nearly all weapons in both armies' arsenals, especially artillery, because they help them to target the warehouses more precisely, or the troops more precisely. And soldiers don't need to expose themselves. They just launch reconnaissance drones to see what is happening on the battlefield. And it's typical that there are between 25 to 50 drones from both sides operating over the contested area. And if we talk about strike drones, they help to destroy the light armored vehicles, and they cause great casualties in the armies. But the challenge here for both armies is to have well-educated drone operators. And I would say here Ukraine is winning over Russia, because for the last year it's been focused on opening the private schools for drone operators, and 10,000 were already trained, and 10,000 more will be trained before Christmas. And there is no state regulation on how it should be done, and it allows more schools to be open faster. There are just official criteria like the ability to fly the drone in certain distance, perform a task without losing control of the drone, and so on. But certification is overseen by the schools.
Mikhailo Fedorov, one of the deputy prime ministers, he runs the Digital Ministry of Transformation. He is key to this story. Could you tell us a little bit about him, his career? What's he been working on? What should we know?
Zelensky brought Mikhailo Fedorov when he was elected. Fedorov is the only minister that kept his position since 2018. He's a veteran right now, and by the way, he is the youngest minister in Ukraine. He was 28 when he took his position, and now he is 32. And back then he was asked to run a new ministry of digital transformation. It was aimed at turning Ukraine into a digital country, or like paperless state, they like to call it. And he created the app called Dia, and he moved common government services into that app. And that reform was very successful, and he became well known because of that. But as the full-scale war broke out, he had more responsibilities after that in the defense sector. So right now he is heading the Army of Drones project. It is his project, and his task is to make sure that there is less bureaucracy, to help more drone manufacturers to start the drone production, and also to train as many drone operators as they can. And now, thanks to him, Ukraine has 12 drone assault companies with about 65 soldiers in each, and 6 more will be created soon. And Ukraine wants to have these assault companies in every brigade. but it's like a long-term project because it still needs, because yes, it can train a lot of drone operators, but the problem is where we are gonna have where we are going to find so many drones, because some Ukrainian companies produce like 100 drones per month, some can produce 1000, some 2000, but no more. They are limited because it's so difficult to get drone components, especially because China tends to sell them more to Russia than to Ukraine. And if talking about Fedorov, thanks to him, there are fewer custom checks and restrictions for the drones when importing them or the components. And also, the companies can make a 25% profit of any drones they sell, and until recently, it was just 1%. So that is a huge increase. That's why from 7 companies that were selling to the army before the full-scale invasion, now we have 40 companies. And almost 200 companies are producing drones, but not all of them can sell to the army because they have to pass the checks, the tests, and to receive the approval from the defense ministry, actually, to sell those drones.
One of the really fascinating parts of your report, Svetlana, was your visit to a sort of a drone training ground. You called it a drone fight club. Could you tell us about that? What did you see? What were they doing?
Yes, it was really amazing. I visited a drone school, and it was in disguise because these are currently the fields are military targets for Russia. So you just come to a gray building and you think, what is that? But you go inside and you see the rooms with the computers, and soldiers there are training to fly drones on simulators. And they were all so excited because it's so difficult for them to receive a permission to go from the front line to Kyiv or other cities, to leave their brigade, to have some time to learn, because their commanders, they tend not to let them go because people are needed in the front line. So they were so happy to be there. There were about 20 students, and they were training like in 20-minute sessions. And there are 3 weeks of learning. First week is in simulators at the school on computers. Second week, it is somewhere in the big building inside, making different tricks and learning to fly already a real drone. And the third week is going to the actual field outside of Kyiv. And there they learn not just to fly a drone, but also to drop the dummy bombs. And the training is very strict, and in the end of every week there is an exam, and if you fail the exam, then they kick you out from the school. Because as the founder of the school told me, that it is a great responsibility for them, because the soldier who doesn't know how to use the drone with the explosive very well, he can kill the whole unit with that bomb if he accidentally drops it too early or if something happens. So it was really fascinating to see that. And also I talked to the instructor, and he said that they try to provide at least 20 hours of flying per course for every soldier, so they are sure when they go to the battlefield they know how to fly the drone and how to drop the bombs, so they will be safe for the brigade and they will be effective.
Drawing all of your reporting together then, Svetlana, what do you think the next few months, half a year, or however long might look like for the Ukrainian drone assault companies?
First, it is to continue encourage Ukrainian manufacturers to produce more drones, to give them more contracts, because they have people, the scientists, the resources, but they don't have money for producing big amounts of drones. So Ukraine has to find money to produce those drones. And also, as Russia is adapted jamming and downing Ukraine's drone fleet, Ukraine is right now working at how to fight with Russian electronic warfare. And I know that the ministry is now giving grants to any businesses who invent how to fight with Russian electronic warfare. And I know that there were some projects offered and the government is already working with those companies, but we will see how that happens, because Russia is very good at downing Ukrainian's fleet, and I know that right now Ukraine is focused on developing drones with artificial intelligence. It helps to fight Russian electronic warfare a lot, because when the drone loses connection with the human operator after coming under attack, instead of crashing on the ground, the drone can accelerate toward its target and to destroy it. So artificial intelligence helps a lot for the drone to complete the mission, and even if you're gonna lose the drone, at least you're gonna hit the target. So this is the priority right now for Ukraine, because all of them, the minister and people at the school and the instructors, they were repeating that it is better to lose a drone than to lose a soldier's life. So I think it is the most important.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much, Svetlana.
Hi Svetlana, good to hear from you again. More open up the drone conversation, because last time I was out in Kyiv, I met a soldier called Alexei, he was part of a team manufacturing its own drone, and he stressed the importance of being able to create entirely Ukrainian drones. He said that was a problem at the moment because some parts, whether they be batteries, would come from China or various other controllers. But he said that the importance was to basically create a drone that is 100% Ukrainian at some point. What fascinates me here is the West is currently pouring weapons into Ukraine, whether it be enough or not for another sort of topic, but the Ukrainians seem to be smart enough to go, this is not going to happen forever. We should really work on our indigenous sort of technologies, whether it be drones or missiles. I was wondering if that's something that you've come across a lot while researching and writing your piece on drones, is the fact that Ukraine now believes that it's time to really build its homemade industrial capacity to create, whether it be FPV drones, these first-person drones, suicide drones, or observation drones. I'd see Russia has done it for many years, but Ukraine lagged behind on that front. So I was wondering, are we seeing that happening now?
Yes, of course. When I came to the Circo drone factory, the founder told me that they have big issues with ordering the components from China. And sometimes they end up buying Chinese components from the US on the inflated price. So right now they found some scientists and engineers who try to replace those components by Ukrainian made ones. But it's a very long process because they need to build them by themselves, so it can take weeks or even months. But I know he told me about Circodron that they made their own battery, and that was amazing. So I think in the future there will be more Ukrainian components, but for now I don't know if there is one Ukrainian drone made completely by Ukrainian components, because all what I heard, maybe there is, but all what I heard was like a part was imported. But anyway, they are working on it.
I'd like to add one more thing that we can maybe discuss, and that's the price of these drones. So the drone that I went to look at, which was, again, it's entirely manufactured in Ukraine, but with parts from various different countries. And the cost of the drone was about £1,700 each, which is, if you put into context with it may not have the same range, but a Storm Shadow, according to Google cruise missile, is over $3 million. So the importance of being able to create these things, not on the cheap, but at a less inflated price than a serious sort of bit of Western kit that's being donated, seems to be a really important step for Ukraine.
Yes, I was told that the importance of producing drones in Ukraine, because they are much cheaper, and as a big amount of drones that are currently used at the front line, they are bought up by volunteers who give those drones as gifts to Ukrainian soldiers, because currently Ukraine can't afford to buy as many drones as they want for the soldiers. That's why Ukrainians donate money to volunteers, and volunteers buy these drones. Or sometimes soldiers give parts of their salaries and to buy the drone for their unit. And what about Circodron that I mentioned, it costs $3,000. And another drones like Lucky Strikes drones that I visited the factory, they costed like $30,000, but for the whole package of 10 drones and the stations, everything, the laptops, everything is needed. So it is much cheaper than buying it from the West. So yes, Ukraine is trying to produce drones here at home. It will be cheaper. And also not only drones, like the missiles, the explosives that are used in the drones, they also try to produce it in Ukraine. But the problem is the Ukrainian regulations and the bureaucracy, and you need a lot of paperwork just to open a factory to produce the explosives. And the drone manufacturers told me that they are not allowed to produce explosives, and it's a big problem when they go to the training school for the soldiers and they train only with dummy bombs, but they are not allowed to train with the real bombs. And they end up working with the real bombs only when they go to the battlefield, and they would like it to be different. So while they are training here on the field, they still can do it and trying to see how it is when their surrounding is not so stressful, and they can learn to do it better. And also the problem with the training in Ukraine right now is when the air raid alert is on, all the flying is forbidden. So the schools have to cancel all the training and to wait till it is over, because of course it is for the security reasons, because Ukrainian air defense is working, but it's still a big problem to find fields where the soldiers can train enough time.
Well, thank you very much, Svetlana and Joe, for all of that. Joe, can I go to you for your final thought?
Yeah, sure. Let's touch back on something Natalia was speaking about yesterday when an American who had been imprisoned in Russia left and then joined the fight in Ukraine. And Natalia put it quite succinctly that this could mean that her friend and fellow journalist Evan Gershkovich, who is currently detained by Russia on these bogus suspicions of espionage, it could basically mean he's imprisoned for longer. So I just wanted to sort of raise how our listeners can help support Evan a little more. So there's a website called freegersovich.com. I'm sure we'll put that in the show notes as well on the podcast. But it's essentially a website where a group of people are working, firstly, to allow people to write letters to Evan while he's being detained by Russia. And it's also then got various fundraising options. You can buy a free Evan baseball hat for $30, which that money will go towards Evan's legal fees, potentially helping his family get in contact, maybe travel to Russia if that's what they want to do, etc. But it seems like a really worthwhile visit to spend 5 minutes of your time if you have it later on today, tomorrow, whenever you're listening to the podcast, just to take a look. So for instance, one of the things that the group did is they wrote a joint letter to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, basically suggesting that Russia's claims that Evan was on some sort of espionage mission are entirely bogus. 332 foreign correspondents signed the letter. All of them have at some point worked in Russia. For some familiar names on there will be Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent, who spent a long time working in Moscow for the Telegraph and various other publications. And then lots of sort of journalists from, whether it be Stephen Erlanger, who's now, I think, based in Berlin for the New York Times, is their chief European diplomatic correspondent. Another friend of mine, Henry Foy, based in Brussels for the FT, he's signed it. And essentially a whole lot of journalists joining together. But it essentially gives you an opportunity to write to Evan and show some support for him, whether it be just in terms of morale or helping to raise funds. So I just think it's that...
Thank you very much for that, Joe. Svetlana, as our guest, would you like the very final thoughts?
Yes, I just seen our listener asked who is doing the training of the drone operators. And the training is done by the drone operators who have the experience. So they were taught by themselves or at any university before, or they already have the experience from the battlefield. They were actually in the army, but right now they work as an instructor and show the soldier how to fly a drone. The problem is that as there are no regulations from the state over the private schools, there are some issues that some instructors that are not so well aware have to work with, especially strike drone. So they train those soldiers, and sometimes the training is done in 3 days instead of 3 weeks. And what can you teach in 3 days? Yes, some basics, but not that essential knowledge that is needed on the battlefield. So that's the problem. And when I asked Fedorov when or how it's going to be regulated, he avoided the question, because for now, like, they aim for the governments to produce a lot of drones to train soldiers, and they don't have time to check the schools to do it properly. And that's a problem, but I don't see that they will do anything about that right now. Ukraine has 26 schools right now for drone operators, and as I heard, most of them are really good ones, and they train soldiers for free. The ministry pays over £170 for every graduated student for schools, and so it helps. But still, there is a problem that some schools just use that and try to graduate as many soldiers as they can to receive that reward from the government.
Thank you so much for joining us, Svetlana. That was really, really interesting. I recommend everybody to go follow your work on the Spectator magazine website, and you can see the article that you've written on the drone warfare in your time in Ukraine at the top of your profile there. So listeners, we would absolutely recommend you to go and read Svetlana's work for yourself as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Earlier today, I spoke to Matt Oliver. Matt is a special correspondent on the Telegraph's business desk. We've been looking at the issues and challenges facing Unilever in Russia over the past week and a bit. I caught up with Matt to try and understand the challenges the company faces, and to understand why it's taking the decisions it has. Here's our conversation. Matt, thanks so much for your time. Last week, the Telegraph revealed a really fascinating story about Unilever and Russian military recruitment. Let's start there. Can you tell us about this story? What did we discover?
Yes, hi David. My colleague Hannah Boland, who's our retail editor, discovered that Unilever had told a campaign group that's operating in Ukraine, it's coordinating with people there and the war efforts, and they were told by Unilever that it would comply with Russian laws, which say that companies have to offer up their staff for conscription to the army if called upon, that they would comply with those laws if they were asked to, which was obviously quite surprising. I think they employ about 3,000 staff in Russia. They operate 8 factories producing all kinds of food and things like tea, drinks as well. And this is obviously very embarrassing for Unilever. They have taken a lot of criticism for remaining in Russia while lots of other large organisations have left. And so I think the way that this letter came out is unfortunate and doesn't put them in a very good light.
What do you think that story shows us about how companies operate in Russia now and the sort of the hurdles, the issues they face when deciding whether to leave or whether to stay?
I think it really undermines the conundrum that they face by staying. It also highlights the risks that they have exposed themselves to by staying. Not only business risks, there are obvious business risks, not being able to get hold of the supplies that you need to make various products. So Unilever, since the war broke out, has halted imports and exports of its own products in and out of Russia. But of course, there are social and political risks too. So, customers who see that Unilever continues to operate in Russia, particularly those in the West, may feel that they don't want to buy things from Unilever anymore. They may be upset by it. Shareholders, of course, may be frustrated with Unilever and the damage that may do to their brand. But I actually think as well, lots of companies, when they pulled out of Russia, when the war first broke out, had to take massive write-downs on their balance sheet, billions of dollars of value wiped off. And many of them did that, and they took the pain at the time, and it was painful. But then that means that they're not exposed to that risk anymore. They're out of Russia. They're not going to be criticised. It's not harming the business anymore. I think that actually what this shows is that Unilever and other businesses that have stayed are not necessarily saving themselves money because they are now in an invidious position. On the one hand, by staying, they could have their staff conscripted, and they've even got the threat of the state seizing control of the business. And on the other, if they leave, they still lose money, which they could have done back when the war first broke out.
The new chief exec has made some comments around this, saying that staying in Russia is the, quote, least bad option. Could you just take us through who he is, why he's saying that, what their sort of defence, what their argument is?
Yes. So I sort of feel for Hein Schumacher, who's the new boss, who started only this month. because the initial decision to actually remain in Russia wasn't his. That was a decision taken by Alan Jope, who was chief executive of Unilever last year and left earlier this year. But I think he is obviously now in charge and appears to have made the decision to continue with what they've been doing. Schumacher this week was quoted as saying that this is the least bad option for us. So we can completely abandon our business. We could try and sell the business, or we could just carry on staying and do what we're doing. He says that they believe that staying and carrying on doing what they're doing is the least bad option. Those are his words. And I think the rationale that Unilever has given are two things, really. And you can make up your own mind about whether they stand up to scrutiny. One is that Unilever says it's selling essential products in Russia. So tea, ice cream, some cleaning products possibly, I think. They have a margarine factory, these sorts of things, which they feel that it's essential to carry on supplying those to the Russian populace. And secondly, they say that, well, if we left or if we allowed our business to be seized by the Russian state, we wouldn't be able to look after our people, our staff. So those are the reasons that Unilever is given for this. But of course, there are many people who say those reasons don't stand up to scrutiny.
What do you make of the sort of Ukrainian campaign against companies that stay in Russia? And the government has accused Unilever of bankrolling Putin's war, but by virtue of operating there and paying taxes.
I have a lot of sympathy with them. I can see those criticisms. I mean, I think the figure that I came across while I was looking at this is, that Unilever last year paid £33 million in tax to the Russian state. So you can justify that statement by the Ukrainians that they are helping to bankroll Putin's war. That money is going into the Russian state's coffers. And I also think, but by continuing to stay and to operate a business in a normal way like that, especially if you're a Western company, I do think that there's a risk that you are tacitly endorsing the war by, allowing life to go on as normal. The whole purpose of Western sanctions and Western companies leaving Russia is supposed to be to demonstrate that things cannot go on as normal. You cannot behave in this way. You cannot flout international law and international norms and carry on operating as you have done and living life as normal. And I think it sort of makes it harder, really, for the Russian people to see the consequences of the war.
Could we just quickly zoom out of the war in Ukraine and put Unilever's sort of travails in a broader economic, political context? Because this isn't the only thing they're facing at the moment that they have to deal with. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. Unilever is in a, I would say, more precarious position on this than some other companies might be. It's never been a company that's allowed itself to be presented as being purely motivated by profit. It's one of the leading British companies in the sort of purpose-driven business movement that we've seen in recent years. Unilever takes great pride in talking about its social purpose, the ethical value of its business, and the great work that its products do. Its mayonnaise isn't just for sandwiches and salads, it's to help reduce food waste. Domestos is, part of an international battle against unsafe sanitation. Nor, I think the catchphrase I came across is reinventing food for humanity. So this is it's very high-minded, high ideals business. And I think that has made the controversies around Russia more painful for them because people see it as a bigger hypocrisy. The other bigger story here from a group perspective for Unilever is that Heinz Schumacher, the new chief executive who replaced Alan Jope this month, has been brought in really to not necessarily do a clean-up job, perhaps that's a bit too strong, but to bring the company back to basics. Under Alan Jope, it was seen to have lost its way a bit, sort of had some criticism from shareholders for perhaps focusing on things like sustainability and so on at the expense of the share price and growth in profits. So he's sort of pulling back slightly on some of those initiatives and has got this mammoth task of turning around the business and making it, more successful again, particularly as they're facing, all kinds of other political headwinds as well. Like, you've got inflation on the horizon and how companies, particularly food companies, are dealing with that. So this is another headache, frankly, that Heinz Schumacher really doesn't need.
Would you just sort of sum up your analysis, if you were to sort of break it down and really, keep it simple for those of us, and I include myself here, who are not business correspondents, how would you really simply sort of boil this down for us?
I would say this is the latest headache that Unilever is facing after its initial decision to remain operating in Russia From a PR standpoint, I'd say it's proved pretty disastrous for them so far. There are not many good things to have come from it. And I think the idea that staff from Unilever could end up being literally conscripted into the Russian war effort, alongside the concerns about Unilever's taxes helping to fund the Russian war effort, will be something of a bit of a nightmare in the HQ back in London for executives. This is a company that's supposed to pride itself on its social value and its purpose. It's a very well-known British brand that owns some of the best-known products that you and I will buy in the supermarket: Dove soap, Domestos cleaner, Magnum ice creams, Ben & Jerry's ice creams, all sorts of very incredibly famous brands. And I think this underlines how companies that perhaps didn't make that difficult decision to exit Russia at the start of the war are now starting to see it come back to bite them in a big way.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. If you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Today's Ukraine the Latest is edited by Rachel Porter. The executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.